Good morning, Lamp. It is good to be back. I hope some of you at least remember I last addressed this group back in 2009, March of 2009 to be exact. That, of course, was the depth of the huge financial crisis. Last time I spoke here, about every 5 minutes, CNBC and CNN were announcing the imminent end of the world. Things were never going to be the same. Everything is awful. Well, here we are 3-4 years later, and it looks like you folks made it. We're all still here. Congratulations. Now, I don't know how many people actually listen to my presentation, but those of you who did back in 2009 may recall I made a couple predictions that turned out to be prescient, actually. Up on the stage, I mentioned, for example, I made a joke of it. I said things were so bad on Wall Street, I heard you could hire an MBA for $10 an hour, and wouldn't it be a great time right now to build a monster agency for the future? And apparently some of you took that advice, because I see some really great agencies out there when I do my travels. And I made another comment. I said that even though things may seem terrible now, I predict that your industry is going to recover nicely because people will flee from risk and run back to the security of the stable, older instruments, financial instruments, and insurance instruments. And sure enough, that is exactly what seems to have happened, and it was you folks that resuscitated this industry, and my hat is off to all of you. You guys did a great job. I think I'll give yourselves a hand. I mean that sincerely. Now, I do a presentation on the subconscious mind, on how to program it, on how to get and stay focused. However, I would like to welcome you all to the age of change. Let me explain. I think when they write the history books 50, 60 years from now, I think this economic blip is going to be an afterthought. I think what really will be noted by the historians is that this was the moment in time when everything came together and things started changing at an absolutely phenomenal rate. Things are changing faster than human beings have ever had to change in the history of man up to this point. And there are certainly thousands of examples I can use. However, I'm going to use this as an example of change, the smartphone. This little number changed my life in a number of ways. See, I get on the internet now instantly. I'm able to carry the largest body of encyclopedic knowledge in the history of man in my pocket. I no longer look things up, I Google them. So now I carry the internet in my pocket, and that was because of the smartphone. I can dictate my schedule into this little number, and it reminds me when to make my phone calls and when my conference calls are due. It has a wonderful little camera where I can take pictures. I no longer carry a little portable camera with me. This is now my camera. It makes videos. This particular model is the new Apple 4S, the Siri model. It has the new voice recognition program. I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but if you have not experienced it, you will soon enough. Because the next change that's likely to be integrated into our lives is voice recognition technology. See, with this thing, you just talk to it, and it answers back like a human being. It's spooky. You tell it to turn my alarm on for 8 o'clock, and it just says, okay, it's fine. You say, find me a steakhouse in the area, and it tells you where the restaurants are, and then it gives you voice directions. I used to truck around the country with a GPS in my suitcase. When I'd land in an airport, I'd take out the GPS, stick up on the windshield, sit there and program the GPS. I don't do that anymore. This is my GPS now. When I get to where I'm going, I press a button and I tell the exact address I'm looking for, and 99 out of 100 times, this thing directs me to it flawlessly. This thing changed my life dramatically. And the reason I use this as a metaphor and as an example, because as a psychologist, I know that human beings typically do not change very rapidly, and yet here we are, changing almost on a yearly basis. Again, using this as a metaphor. Do you mind if I ask, how many of you folks out there in the audience actually own a smartphone? May I see by show of hands? Take a look around you. Got to be well over 95% of you. Do any of you remember when this little device was invented, when the iPhone was introduced? The iPhone came out in 2007. 5 years ago, no one had one. 5 years later, everyone has one. That's a remarkable rate of change. And let me put that in perspective for you. If you Google it, how old is mankind? Anthropologists will tell you that man has been on this planet for roughly 250,000 years. Now, they've uncovered bones that are almost 1 million years old, but when they talk about human beings, They're talking about things like ritualistic burials, cave drawings, complicated language acquisition, the use of tools. Human beings have been on this planet, as far as we can tell, about 250,000 years. Do any of you know when the wheel was invented? If you Google it, you'll discover the wheel was invented in 8000 BC. Do the math, and you'll realize that it took human beings 240,000 years before someone figured out how to make a wheel. That's the rate of change we were talking about. Let's look at another big change in mankind. Another big change was the invention of the plow. The reason the invention of a plow was such a huge change is it allowed man to till the soil and to stay put. He no longer had to be a wander-gatherer. He could actually generate his food from where he was standing, and that gave rise to the great civilizations. Turns out the plow was invented in 5000 BC. So it took him another 3,000 years after inventing the wheel to get to the plow. Another huge change was the invention of the printing press. Because now all this knowledge that man was acquiring, instead of having to handwrite the books and transfer it, they can now mass produce knowledge and pass it out to the masses. Turns out the Gutenberg printing press was 1430, almost 6,500 years after the plow. From the printing press to the telephone. Telephone was 1870, now you're down to 450 years. From the telephone to the cell phone was 1970, now you're down to 100 years. From the cell phone to the iPhone, 37 years. From the time it was introduced to the time everybody's using it, less than 5 years. When I grew up, the biggest change that came to telephones was we went from rotary to push button. And that took them 40 years. Look how fast things are changing. Again, to put it in perspective, I am no longer a young man, but I am not an old man either. I have not been around that long. And yet, the day I was born, there were 2.5 billion people on this planet. We crossed a milestone about 4.5 months ago. Do any of you know what the current population of the world is estimated to be? We crossed the 7 billion mark 4.5 months ago. Now think about that. Again, it took 250,000 years to get to 2.5 billion. And in the course of a single lifetime, we have nearly tripled that number. Think of how many policies that represents. Think of the sales potential. Give you another example. The day I was born, there was no such thing as color television. No one had the faintest clue what plate tectonics were. Nobody understood the structure of DNA. There was no such thing as fast food. There was no digital anything. There were no digital clocks, no digital timers, no digital calculators. There were no computers. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. None of that. And all those changes, not a single satellite had circled the Earth the day I was born, and now we have 4,500 of them circling this planet. We have been to the moon and back. We have dropped probes into the moons of Saturn. We are crawling all over Mars looking for life, all within a single lifetime. Think about that. The rate of change is getting exponential. In fact, it's estimated that the total body of knowledge of humankind, of mankind, is now doubling every 10 years. A phenomenal rate of change. And of all the changes I just mentioned, the one that I personally believe was the most impactful was when we went from analog to digital. When we changed from analog to digital, things started really speeding up. All of a sudden, remember those little cassettes you used to use? Became CDs. Remember the VHSs? Morphed into DVDs. All of a sudden, everybody's got a laptop computer. All of a sudden, everybody's running around with digital cell phones. What really sped it all up was that change from analog to digital. And I have a point, believe it or not, and here it is. As all this change has sped up and picked up on us, it's also changed us. I believe our thinking is also changing without us even realizing it.